A Pluralist Order by Common Man. Chapter 2. Factionalism, Hamilton, Jefferson, and Party Politics in the United States. There are a number of quandaries within our present global institutions, which can only be resolved through compromise. New systems of compromise must first be established at the local level. This must be achieved around the world before any debate about a new global system. The reason for this is what is known as factionalism. As populist sentiments increase, so also do the number of competing factions. Next, as the status quo breaks down, the elites will begin to throw their weight behind the various competing new factions. This reaction can either be an effort to increase their own lot or merely an effort to survive. The people must also begin to unite with like-minded family, friends, and neighbors before joining together with the greater local community. The globalists are being forced to first compromise locally with their own people. However, they cannot do so until the people first compromise with and amongst themselves. The populist fracturing of the American political parties has been noted by many. Perhaps it is best described by geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan. Zeihan observes that going into the 2016 presidential election cycle, the factions which made up the Democratic and Republican parties have remained largely unchanged since the Great Depression. The Republican Party's factions, or voter blocs, at this time were defined by Zeihan as being the pro-business, pro-national security, pro-life, and evangelical groups. Whereas the Democratic Party's factions were labeled by him as women, blacks, LGBTs, socialists, under 30, pro-green movement, pro-unions, and pro-choice. Whether or not you agree with his characterization of these factions, all can agree that some similarly called groups or factions have been in place for an entire lifetime. Zeihan then states that these factions, which should also include traditional swing vote blocs like Hispanics and Catholics, shattered into their constituent parts. The American political landscape, though still having the form of a two-party system, has shattered into 1,000 various factions. Each voting bloc no longer has any allegiance to any political party. By the time Donald Trump was inaugurated president, the Republican coalition was composed only of populists with a few evangelicals. The Democratic Party seems to have lost all but the Greens and women. Note Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal. Some portions of the black and LGBT community still ardently support the Democrats, but these communities are far too large and diverse to be lumped into one sole voting bloc. The rest of the stereotypical factions Zeihan lists are now all in the swing vote category. The principal point being that our two-party political system is no longer functioning. Neither side currently has a large enough coalition of constituents to successfully govern. Does the gridlock in Washington, D.C. make more sense now? George Friedman, another notable geopolitical expert, has remarked that this breakdown of American political factions occurs in a cyclical process spanning approximately 50 years. Of course, such a time frame is not designated in order to be precise, but to give an approximation of shifts in political opinions which are spawned approximately every generation and dominate the subsequent lifespan. For example, Friedman's Jacksonian era was best exemplified by the presidency of Thomas Jefferson and Jeffersonian ideals. Jefferson was president a full generation before the election of Andrew Jackson, the president who lent his name to the era, as it truly started at his inauguration. Until that time, presidents had been mostly Federalist in point of view. From that point forward, they would be much more democratic. One can only assume that this process happens when a brilliant individual inspires the hearts and minds of a younger generation yet to take power. Like Zion's labeling of political factions, there is an inherent flaw in the design of this explanation. It is purposefully imprecise. It is as if these experts presume that precision is a thing that cannot be achieved, so it is not even worthy of striving for. I ardently disagree. Let us seek precision against all odds. We should do this because in labeling factions lies the greatest danger. All politics should truly be about the individual first, followed by popular sovereignty with no regards to labels. With this in mind, we shall briefly follow the evolution of American political factionalism from its beginning to the present day. To do so, we must go back over 200 years to the time of our founding fathers. During our first presidency, George Washington decided that he wanted the best and brightest at each post in his cabinet. This included Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State and Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. The two disagreed so sharply over the founding of a national bank that what began as an inter-cabinet feud spilled over into national politics, just as national politics were having their foundations laid. Therefore, this feud still influences our elections today. So what was at the core of their quarrel? Jefferson and Hamilton's feud still resonates today because it resulted in a two-party system that in many ways still exists today. Hamilton formed the Federalist Party around his supporting factions. In response, Jefferson united the opposition factions into what he called the Republican Party. Most historians now refer to this party as the Jeffersonian or Democratic Republicans. These parties have undergone various evolutions from the late 18th century to the present day. The Federalists evolved into the Whigs, which led to the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. The factions behind the Lincolnian Republicans remained largely unchanged until the 2016 election. The Jeffersonian Republicans evolved into the Jacksonian Democrats, which survived, some factions remaining solid even before and after the Civil War, until Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal solidified a new national coalition. This coalition still clings to some life, but must reform itself to be viable in the 2020 election cycle. Throughout all of these evolutions, the two major parties have always adhered to the core tenets established by their patriarchs. What, then, are the similarities and differences between these two great men, Hamilton and Jefferson? First, They were both great adherents of natural law. They were both disciples of the great Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Hobbes, and Montesquieu, whose doctrines greatly influenced the American Revolution. So long as the spirit of '76 permeated the air, no real difference would be found between the two. In fact, our Constitution is in many ways a compromise formed around their core areas of agreement. How is it then that their differences are what echoes down to us through history? It is because, though the differences are slight, they are profound in implication. Hamilton believed in a strong central government that was involved in the economy. To do this, Hamilton wanted protective tariffs and to establish a national bank. One must adhere to a loose construction of the Constitution in order to establish such an institution. Hamiltonians, as wealthy members of society, feared anarchy or mob rule. Thus, they believed the purpose of government is to protect property rights against these forces. The Jeffersonians believed the strongest governments should be at the local level, as local, self-reliant governments are best able to respond to the people's unique needs. Unfortunately, during the Jacksonian era, this doctrine became known as states' rights, and thus became enmeshed with the rights of slaveholders, and has never been able to recover its original, equal political clout. The 10th Amendment was the foundation of the Constitution to the Jeffersonian mind. The label of strict constructionist is accurate in describing them, as they believed any power not directly listed in the Constitution belonged to the individual states or to the sovereign individual, whom they deemed almost sacred. To this end, Jefferson once said, "To take a single step beyond these boundaries is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible to any definition." This led the Jeffersonians to be against a national bank or protective tariffs. Finally, the Jeffersonians did not fear the masses. They were the masses. Instead, they feared tyranny, whether from a dictatorial monarch or an elite plutocracy. These divisions are very important to understand, as the current coalitions of the two-party system have broken down. A breakdown that has occurred several times throughout history. Each time the factions reform, they do so around these central tenets. There will be those who wish to protect their property and the status quo. They will settle with the party of greater centralization, more protective tariffs, and more involvement of the government in the economy. Then there will be those who fear tyranny. They will unite against further centralization of the government in favor of local rule. Some might go further and abolish national banks and protective tariffs before returning the Constitution to its 10th Amendment base. How a faction is labeled, whether male or female, black or white, straight or gay, matters far less than those core American political conflicts. The competing sides have always found ways to compromise, except during the Civil War. They must compromise now to avoid calamity.